I had my eyes down and I heard this horrific yell. And I looked up, and the guy, who wasn't more than 5'1", tiny little guy, strong, had come up behind the correctional nurse and reached behind her, grabbed her face, and started shaking her head.
You're listening to Creativity Unconfined. Stay tuned to learn about how the arts unlock the doors for those who are imprisoned.
Welcome to yet another episode of Digging Deeper with Dave. I am been so excited about what we've been doing so far that why not? Let's just keep going. This is yet another special episode, I guess, special, maybe not so special, of our podcast, Creativity Unconfined, and I remain, as ever, Dave. So, Ms. Nichols, we ended the last episode with some rather up-in-the-air type of comments. Are there any questions based on that?
Yeah, I think the object of curiosity here is the identity shift that you alluded to, kind of what seems to be a pivotal moment in your time working in this setting.
First off, let me put out there that there should be a trigger warning at the beginning of this story. Because something fairly serious happened while I was inside. And I had been in situations before where there were those that were incarcerated would get worked up during my sessions, or they would get angry, or they would throw something, or somehow they would get aggressive or violent, and I would do what I could to deflect or get out of there or make it safe. Now, this was not necessarily a pivotal moment, but this was a way for me to recognize how fragile identity is on the work that we do and how we're seen. Because remember, I was a therapist. I was a clinician. I was there to provide care. I was seen as neither either side, as I indicated in a couple of episodes ago. I was more of somewhat nurturing and somewhat supportive and somewhat humorous. I was humorous Dave. That's, I could do that in all the sessions. There was a genuineness to seeing the funny side of everything that happened. But there was this one episode this one period where there was a person brought to the unit the night before. This is, again, the mental health unit that I'm on. And somebody had been brought to the mental health unit that hadn't been reviewed yet. I hadn't had a chance to evaluate them to see what groups or sessions they can come in. The social worker hadn't met with them yet. We didn't know anything about him. There wasn't much paperwork. And this was one of those unusual circumstances where I was actually advocating not to bring him out for one of my sessions, one of my groups. And the correctional staff and the correctional nurses, and I believe they had the best interests at heart, to say, no, we need to get him out of that cell. On our unit, it was all single cell placements because it was a mental health unit. They were all on different medication. They all had to be monitored separately. They all had their own individual placement. And they would all be brought out of those cells. And the group that they wanted to bring him out was nothing more than a rec time, right? Because I was the rehabilitation therapist / art. And this is one of those moments that I had to do rehabilitation work. And because it was miserable weather outside, instead of bringing him out to the outside yard, they brought him down the end of the hallway. And at the end of the hallway, there would be a perpendicular space that would be almost like a go-through space hallway where they had weight rooms, and they had the weights, the universal weights. They had tables bolted to the floor, and then they had the elevator, and then they had a fence or a gate that would open out to the other part of that side. So it was an enclosed room, battleship gray. And what basically we did was we ran activities. Oftentimes it was playing spades or chess, or we would talk to the guys, or we would just kind of hang out. I'm stalling till I get to this story here because it's difficult. And at the end, all the correctional staff went down to one end by the gate, except for one correctional nurse who sat at one of the tables. The tables would be bolted to the ground. It was a metal round table with four seats around it, just stools. And that's where we would play cards or play dominoes or sit and talk. And I was sitting at one of them over here with my eyes towards the rest of the room, and one of the correctional nurses was sitting there facing 3 other guys playing cards. And the person they let out was just walking around the perimeter of the entire space. So I'm sitting there talking to somebody, and at that point, one of my colleagues, who's a rec therapist, is walking through to take the elevator down. He saw our space as a shortcut. He had to do something on one of the S units. Came back through to go back down to his unit over in A dorm. And I had my eyes down, and I heard this horrific yell. And I looked up, and the guy, who wasn't more than 5'1", tiny little guy, strong, had come up behind the correctional nurse and reached behind her, grabbed her face, and started shaking her head. And I yelled for support. Nobody heard me. They were all on the other end. It wasn't that far away, but the way that the acoustics worked, they couldn't hear me. I yelled, realizing, and all the other incarcerated men stood up and watched. So I jumped in. And I didn't know what I was going to do, but I jumped in because I saw him wrestling with her, ready to break her neck, which is what he's trying to do. It turns out later we found out, not to give away the punchline, but this person had been somebody who had murdered a number of women down in San Diego by sneaking up behind them in the park and breaking their neck. And so that's what he was trying to do to her. I jumped in and I held them together so that her head would be still while I'm wrestling them both to the ground. And my colleague, who's a rec therapist, jumps in as well, and another incarcerated gentleman jumped in to help. I was able to get my arms around him, and we were taught all sorts of ways of defensive behavior. I don't know if I was doing that. All I know is I grabbed him. He was strong. And all I knew is I can't let him get me. At this point, the correctional nurse has blood running down her face. Turns out that before I got to them, he had grabbed her eyes and clawed out her eyes. And so by the time I got to him, there's blood all over his hands. I grabbed him and I threw him into the corner where the floor met the wall, and I kept him pressed up against there, knowing that if I got off of him, he's going to attack me, not knowing what's going on behind me, not knowing where the other incarcerated men are doing, not knowing what my colleague is doing. All I can see is the correctional nurse sitting there on the floor with her hands over her eyes with blood running down. And it was then that up on the 3rd floor that one of the correctional officers heard this and came running out. Nobody on the end of the hall. It was the correctional officer that came running down because my colleague blows his whistle, got everybody coming down. I'm shoving him into the wall, hoping against hope that I'm pushing his face against the wall. It was so animalistic on my part. But I was so revved up, and I don't know what's going to happen. Till the correctional officers came down and they managed to get his hands behind him. It took a few moments to get some handcuffs on him and then brought him inside. At this point, I'm shaking. At that point, the medical team is looking at the nurse and realizing that they needed to get the correctional nurse out of there. We're all standing there. They called for additional backup, and they got all of the guys up against the wall and brought them inside. I knew who it was, the incarcerated gentleman that jumped in, who helped. And I immediately said, he helped. And I'll write up a report to indicate that he helped. I want this on his record that he supported him. My colleague was there. He and I sat there just overwhelmed by this. Correctional nurses came down, and because it wasn't their fault, but the space, none of us knew what to expect. We didn't know that the acoustics were so off that they were like, we didn't know what was going on. I'm furious. I'm so angry. And I remember the program director had come in, and they were going to have a meeting with all the correctional staff to de-escalate them, to see how they were doing. And I was like, I want no part of this. And he asked me, are you okay? I'm like, I don't want to talk about this. I was furious and angry and worked up and agitated. She's now permanently blind because of what he did. But to find out, and I felt guilty that we couldn't get to him sooner, only to find out that he was going to break her neck. And I remember it happened on a Tuesday because I was fine all week. The next Tuesday, I woke up at 3 a.m. before going to work that day, 3 in the morning shaking like I was crazed, and I just couldn't stop shaking. But when I talk about identity, here's what happens. Up until that point, I'm seen as a therapist. I'm seen as someone who's nurturing. I'm seen as someone who's supportive. And instead, I'm in the mix of this, throwing him up against the wall, putting hands on him to protect the correctional staff, to protect somebody. And I was seen no longer as somebody who's nurturing, nobody who's seen as a therapist. I am seen as somebody who's willing to fight, which changes the dynamics, which changes the identity issue. And I could have done one of several things. If it was several years before that, I probably would have ignored it and let it go away and waited until a new crop of people came through who didn't know this had happened. Instead, I was like, we've got to address this, because if I'm going to continue working here, I need to work with these guys and let them see what happens. And that's when we had several weeks worth of issues on identity and how identity changes based on who we are interacting with, and how that dynamic changes based on how other people see you and how other people observe you and how they define you and label you, and that becomes your identity, which, by the way, this becomes the precursor for my work 10 years later on social interactionism, but I didn't know it at the time. All I know is I had to reaffirm what my identity was and let them realize that my identity was a hell of a lot more complex than they thought it originally was, which is fairly two-dimensional, which is the same danger we get in with them. We see them as two-dimensional figures, and we don't see them as complex three-dimensional forms. And here I realized that that's how they saw me. And now I had to kind of reaffirm, I had to absolutely reaffirm what my identity was and how much more complex it was. And that's changed my outlook on where I was working, what I needed to do to constantly check my identity and see where I was there and what I was doing. And it was about 2 or 3 years later, as things continued to evolve and change, it was about 2 years later that I was like, I need to find myself doing something else. And so that's when I left.
After all this happened, you reinforced your identity, or clarified it through sort of, psychoeducation with them, would you say?
More like processing. I don't even know if it was psychoeducation as in teaching them what identity meant, but rather, let's examine this and let's see how, we used art, we used form, but what's your take on this? What's your image of this? How do you think this evolved? And then, unusually, for the first time, I'm going to do the same thing.
So you're, instead of running away from the transferential dynamic, you have to
And it was
embrace
and it was counter-transferential as well.
Mhm.
I have to embrace it.
Yeah.
I have to use the transferential dynamic to let them see what can occur, who I was, who the other staff are, and the dynamics that can occur inside. And recognize that we're a lot more complex in those dynamics. And also, by the way, it's not just for them. It was for me as well, right? I had to kind of reestablish who I was and what my role was, and am I somebody who's going to be willing to, to throw hands, so to speak, and get in the mix of it, or be that nurturing therapist, and realized when push comes to shove, I can help someone else and get in the middle of it. But does that take away from the empathy that I'm going to hold? Do I feel anything for that guy? I don't know. And that's scary. Do I feel thankful for the other people that were there, that supported and jumped in? Yeah.
That leads me to my next question, which I thought of when you were in the thick of this story, is that we started this podcast looking through, the greater cultural societal lens of what's happening right now is that true crime is romanticized. These stories like yours are compelling, morbidly so, for people. And that's just human nature, but is there anything that you can speak to in regards to this?
Yeah, true crime is compelling for people who haven't been involved in it firsthand. I'm not saying it was a true crime episode. It is a reality of what can happen anywhere. That kind of assault can happen anywhere. I saw firsthand of what it's like inside, what the reality is, what those established systems do to people inside, to everybody that's inside, not just those that are incarcerated, but everybody inside. And true crime without pointing fingers, has a tendency to two-dimensionalize and cartoon. We're going to use that as a verb, to cartoon the people that are taking part in it, and it becomes a lot more complex than that. Could there have been a true crime episode of that one guy, and in my mind, I've true crimed him, so to speak, because that's going to sweep the nation. There's a very two-dimensional concept I hold for that guy. I don't know anything about him. He was brought in that night. He came out from my 10 o'clock group. We brought him out in handcuffs and put him up on the third floor in isolation, and I never heard from him again. He is a non-person to me because I don't know anything about him. And that's painful as a therapist. Can there be a true crime episode of that? Yes, because he's not real.
I like that you reverted to art language. Two-dimensional.
Oh, yeah.
Three-dimensional and cartooning.
Mm-hmm. I've done a lot of art about this, too.
Yeah, I mean, it speaks to who you are and the work that you're doing, but also the humanity of it all.
It's still, this happened 30 years ago. And telling that story, and I've told that story before in different contexts, but telling that story, I'm still shaking. It's overwhelming. I mean, I've been involved with assaults before, and I've been involved with fights growing up, and I've seen things firsthand. I don't know why this one affects me that much, and perhaps it's because it shouldn't have happened in the first place, and maybe that's what affects me to this day. I've been working every year since then to try and prevent such things from happening again, and knowing that if need be, I can be involved in something like that, but it doesn't make me feel any better.
So there's almost, like you said, a sense of responsibility toward prevention.
Oh, sure, or avoidance, and there have been other circumstances that have been able to redirect certain situations. If it's coming right at me, it was easy for me to redirect. This wasn't coming at me, so I had no space for that. Maybe I don't quite know what that means yet. I think I'm going to continue to evaluate that and kind of recognize that. I did write about that somewhat in the book Art and Art Therapy with the Imprisoned Recreating Identity, because it's our own identity as well. And I'll tell that story again, because I do think it's an extreme illustration of what happens and what can occur and change your identity within a moment's notice that's unexpected. And then how do we walk back from that? So that story will come out again, perhaps not to the extent that I told it here, but it's always going to be a part of my recognizing how we have to kind of figure out who we are at any given moment and how we're going to use that as we continue to decide as we move forward.
That's so important to reiterate, too, that this is not just a byproduct of the setting that you were in. Like you said, for those who are feeling fear or a certain opinion about what goes on in prisons and the people inside of there, you're framing this as just something that happens in life.
Oh,
and this is a takeaway for anybody.
Well, I think that was. Let me put it this way: I expected that to happen more likely at a family reunion than where it happened. It's the reality of who we are as clinicians, that we put ourselves in positions that sometimes the people we work with are unpredictable, and we have to learn to predict the unpredictable, or at least prepare for that as best as we can.
Creativity Unconfined has been brought to you by Florida State University's Institute for Arts and Art Therapy with the Imprisoned. Special thanks to our producers Sydney Nichols and Malia Burrows, as well as Florida State University's College of Fine Arts. If you like what you heard, and even if you didn't, please support us by liking and subscribing.